is going to be even better than any that we have had. We have very senior ladies and gentlemen with us. I'm going to run this session in a very, very open-ended way. In other words, whatever are on the minds of the panelists that cause them to lose sleep at night, whatever the worries may be, as the National Security Advisor, Madam just mentioned, there are many issues, not just from the hard side, also in the other side, such as energy, such as financial security, such as energy security, and so forth. So I will begin with Jehan.
Yes, sir.
You are, I think, the only business person on this panel besides myself.
Okay.
So perhaps we can begin with you. Tell us what worries you. Tell us what you really, really hate to see happen.
Okay. Thank you very much. My name is Canan Çelebioglu. I'm from Turkey, from the Celebi group. We are in aviation sector as a group since actually 1958. So our company is quite old in the aviation. I was born actually in aviation because our company was established in Turkey by my father. So since 16 of age, I'm in aviation. But of course, why I started with aviation, I think aviation sector among some other sector, it is one of the most delicate sector which really affected by the very small actually issues. But when I say small, of course, it's generally for a country like Turkey, as we are started from Turkey, terroristic activities is very small issues in Turkey for many years. Because unfortunately, because of a lot of different actually problems among our own country, as you know, our borderline countries, there were sometimes some activities in the political or in the some other reasons. And unfortunately, since 1980s, we have some Kurdish nationalistic issues in our country. Because of that, or because of some Armenian problems, we had different subjects. We always had a fear that something could happen in any place in Turkey, which affects, of course, a lot of things in Turkey. But first of all, the Turkey based on the tourism for many years, after 80s especially, and which is very much linked to the, of course, aviation sector. Because aviation all over the world, I think the best area where it grows much rapidly than the standard business trip is tourism. So whenever anything actually occurs in the country, even it could be just a silent bomb or anything, because of the actually known situation in Turkey, it was affected a lot in the tourism side. But if it is becoming much more, of course, often, which some years it was the case, even at the moment we have some issues like that, automatically it also affects the economy of Turkey, which actually at the end affects the situation in our sector. So in aviation, especially, I might say, these are the main two issues, but because of our, again, own sector risks, what we can say, any actually problems occurs around Turkey, there could be sometimes closing the airports because of some other security problems, which easily can happen actually one night. For example, at the moment, I think you all know that we have really critical and risky days is going on in Turkey. Because of this, of course, one day, one morning, when you wake up, you can find your country partially, maybe, but which affects the whole country in the war, which is, of course, I think for any country or any business is the biggest risk for the any business area, private or governmental bodies. But because of Turkish logistical situation, this was the case in different places in Turkey because of our surrounding countries' conflicts. What happens actually after having this type of, I think, problems in your own country and in your main business country? Because at the moment we are in different countries as well in aviation sector, so that in Europe, for example, you don't feel any this type of risks, of course. But when we came to India, it was our first year actually. When we started in Mumbai, there was that unfortunate terroristic attack in a hotel, as you all, I think, know, which was another similar case which we had in Turkey, as I said, in the different time of the years in the past. So these things you cannot really escape, so you have to find your own way to deal with the problems, as all countries doing. And as a business person, even I might say that there is a reason behind that it can keep you awake during the night, but it is not every night, of course. So generally, what I can say, the more problematic things maybe for me to keep me awake all nights, which I finally solved the problem, was my husband, of course. Because he started to snore.
Serious problems.
So, but finally, we separate the rooms, we solve the problem. So we are happily living together still. So every problem can be solved, what I can say. Other than that, of course, again, if you are going to different countries, even in Turkey, in the past years, when I talk about 1980s, even 1990s, there were also some type of things could happen in the politic arena, which I meant when there is an election comes in the country like Turkey, you really start to think about what will happen after the election. Because the countries like Turkey, which is still on the developing side of a lot of actually area as a regulation, as a actually standard or as a opening laws, the new government could really create a lot of difference for the future in your business, because they might change the regulation in your sector in actually few weeks, which they never consult with the sector players, which used to be like that in Turkey. And fortunately, last actually 10 years, they are more welcoming the private sector to consult any changes on the regulation. But still, of course, at the end, they decide what they want to do. But at least we can give the consultation. So the election time, for example, it was a second area for us being in Turkey. have a really some question in your mind how the things will develop in the future in your country, in your sector. Because again, it is not only what they decide in aviation sector, what they decide for taxation, how they actually approach to the banking system, how they approach to actually the currency, because all of these economical actually criteria which very much affects your own business. But as we have been grown in Turkey as a business person, I believe it helped us a lot to be able to go to the different countries much easier than a lot of European or American companies. Because our economy and our governmental bodies, for many years, it was not stabilized. So which means every year or every next month, you can come face with the different application in the different area which affects your company in a financial way or in a actually service provide areas or your own sector. It can give you big actually opportunities at the same time, but vice versa, it can give you a lot of, I might say, headaches to really deal and solve for your own company. So after having a lot of this uncertainty, you really train yourself to deal with any condition, which means we can easily take a risk in the unstabilized economy and the countries where actually you can easily have big opportunities.
Can I ask you a question? You didn't mention about desecularization of the government. Is that a worry on your mind, that the government, the next election, will become more religious?
I think there is two answers for that. One is personal, which I don't need to say it here. It's a worry for me. Second is as a business person. I say that no, I don't worry about that.
Good.
I don't think it will be affected very much on business life, but on the private life, we don't know.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Secretary Sibal, you are the Foreign Secretary of India. Now, India is a big country. You have many neighbors. You must have a lot of things to worry about.
Yes, a lot of nightmares. So
Pakistan, China.
Let me outline some of these nightmares.
Please do.
I think strangely I had put terrorism on top as Madame Celebi also did, because I think the epicenter of global terrorism is very much in our region. We are victims. Afghanistan is victim. China is victim. The Central Asian countries are victims. And Turkey has had its problems over years. Russia has a problem, especially southern Russia. So the international community has not so far succeeded in suppressing this menace sufficiently, and it will be difficult to do so. And since these forces now are dispersed and are finding safe havens in many more countries than before, and since these forces are interlinked and through modern means of communication, they can act anywhere at any time, we have to be extremely watchful. And the consequences of big terrorist acts, not only on terrorism, but even on foreign investment and business in general, can be pretty serious. The second nightmare, if you like, is Afghanistan and the post-2014 scenario there.
Say it again, please.
In Afghanistan, the post-2014 scenario, because yes. Afghanistan currently is witnessing NATO military operations It's a very unstable situation. The politics is very unstable. The economy is very fragile. But what concerns us is the reaching out to the Taliban and the kind of accommodation that the Taliban is potentially being offered. Although notionally some red lines have been drawn, but it also appears that in the anxiety to quit Afghanistan, there may be some compromises made. And therefore, if the Taliban kind of ideology is seen to be as successful, and as an ideology which the West cannot cope with, and earlier the Russians could not deal with it successfully, then I think such ideologies can raise major challenges for neighboring countries in the hope that they can achieve the same success vis-à-vis them as they would have succeeded vis-à-vis United States, NATO, etc., etc. If this happens, there is also the potential of a civil war in Afghanistan. And the impact of this on India is something that does worry us. The third is Iran, because there is as yet no solution in sight to the Iran nuclear question. The talks of P5+1 with Iran are being held intermittently, but there's no clarity as to whether any breakthrough is going to be reached. In the meantime, it is very clear the American president has said that he will not allow Iran to go nuclear, and Israel is straining on the leash to take military action. And if, unfortunately, things move in that direction, the impact on the region would be extremely deleterious. And for us too, because we have in the Gulf about 6 million expatriates, which are sending back about $40 billion of remittances. And 80% of our energy supplies come from this region. Now in Libya, when the military operation occurred, we were able to move out 18,000 Indians with great difficulty, but we can't move out 6 million Indians from the Gulf. So it's a nightmare. If any military situation develops, it is a nightmare in terms of consequences, and of course the impact on global oil prices. And since we are energy deficient, and we have our current account deficit is not primarily but largely on account of our oil imports and this and that. If the prices shoot up, it can have a destabilizing effect on our current efforts to control the economic problems we are facing and jack up our growth rates again. Then I would also say that in the general turmoil that we are seeing in this area, there is the developments in the Arab world, where I think we have been talking very wrongly about a so-called Arab Spring. Right from the start, at least, people like us doubted very much whether this was a correct description of what was happening on the ground. And as time has passed, I think it is being demonstrated that our skepticism was not wrong, and that we now actually have a resurgence of Islamism in this region, including the extreme versions like Salafism. And the governments that are coming to power have absolutely no tradition of democracy. They do not believe in democratic values. And the expectation that they'll bring in change and make the regimes more democratic, to my mind, is fantasizing a little bit.
And overnight, by the way.
And then in the background is looming the question of the Shia-Sunni conflict, which is being promoted in different ways by interested parties. India, as a country with the second largest Muslim population, or the third largest, depending on figures, and the second largest Shia population in the world, we need to be concerned about any move in this kind of a direction, because it can destabilize the relationship between Islamic sects in India. I would also very briefly say that China's rise, about which in an earlier panel when the National Security Advisor was here, was mentioned. We do see increasing Chinese assertiveness. There are problems in South China Sea. There are tensions between China and Japan. We have serious border differences with China, which remain unresolved, although we are entering into a relatively stable phase in our relations with China, which has become our largest trading partner in goods, though this year the volume of trade has fallen dramatically. Nevertheless, I think the two countries are managing their relationship well, but since China's policies are somewhat unpredictable, and since we have serious differences on the border, the Tibetan question, the Dalai Lama, one could envisage some unpredicted difficulties arising, which may actually throw off track the relationship as a whole, more so with the relative decline of the United States, which was spoken about again in the earlier panel, and the US withdrawal from this region. China may theoretically feel that space is being opened for them to increase their assertiveness. And while at this moment they are reaching out to India with a obviously view not to discourage us from entering into the US orbit, if you like, their attitude may change potentially if they feel that the United States is withdrawing and they have more room for maneuver. So managing our relations with China and making sure that these two biggest Asian countries maintain a certain equilibrium in Asia, which is very necessary also for the economic growth and the regional security architecture in Asia, would be a big challenge. And finally, I would say that coming to India per se, that the declining rates of growth in India, the rising aspirations of our people, the need for creating millions of new jobs with the accelerated rate of urbanization that India must go through in order to boost its economy, the issue of skill development. Then on the economic side, the question of subsidies and the stalling of economic reforms, the disparity in incomes, the whole emphasis on inclusive growth, which in itself is fine, but when linked to electoral politics, puts lots of pressures on the economy, which are avoidable. The whole issue of developing a manufacturing base, improving our infrastructure, encouraging increased flows of the foreign direct investment, implementation issues, corruption issues. All these are issues we have to contend with. And these are the factors which actually are very pertinent in terms of the growth of the Indian economy and what the Indian economy can contribute in terms of growth of the global economy. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I have news for you. The Foreign Secretary, Sibal, does not sleep at night. He has many things to worry about. Did you say India water was one of them? Did you mention?
No, I didn't say
the
water.
First one that you mentioned was.
No, I didn't say water, but I don't think. Let me make a point here, which is not perhaps understood. There is no country in the world, which has been so generous in terms of sharing waters as India.
As India.
Because in our Indus Waters treaties with Pakistan, 80% of the waters of the Indus Basin go to Pakistan and only 20% come to India. Only 20%. And we have strictly abided by the terms of our treaty despite our conflicts with Pakistan, including this whole issue of terrorism. We have not departed from our commitments. We have shared the waters of the Ganges, which actually serves the drinking water, industrial, agricultural needs of the whole Gangetic Plain, which has a population of about 400 million people. And yet we have had an accord with Bangladesh where the lean season flows are equally shared. And we are now discussing also recognizing the lower riparian rights of Bangladesh with regard to other rivers. Now, even I served in Turkey as ambassador. I remember when they were building the Ataturk Dam, the Iraqis and the Syrians were saying, what is happening? And the Turks said, look, we have water, you have oil, so nature has given us some benefit, nature has given you some benefit, so there it is. Let's have oil for water exchange. But in other parts of the world, it's like that. So we are concerned about what China may do in Tibet in terms of the Brahmaputra river there. At the moment, they are saying these are run-of-the-water projects and they will not affect the flow of water of the Brahmaputra when it enters India. We take the Chinese at their word, but there is this concern that the large Chinese projects of moving the waters from south to north to water your northern plains, where the Chinese northern plains, where all your wheat production is there, and the tremendous skills that Chinese have to conceive of and implement huge infrastructural projects, does leave us a little concerned about what may happen in the future. But for the moment, I think we are not losing too much sleep.
Good. At least you can take a little sleep, take a little nap. Admiral, you are also from Turkey, very important country, not just historically, but today, geographically, economically, part of EU or not part of EU, and all that issues. Immigration is of concern. Give us your perspective, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before the panel started, we had a short talk, and you said you encouraged us to feel free in our speeches, well, I will do so. Instead of talking about only Turkey and what we face from a security point of view, I would like to start with a general view.
Very good.
On security matters. I was very much impressed yesterday that during inaugural speech, security was one of the important subjects that was touched upon. And also today at lunchtime, again, it was a very important issue came out, and one of the distinguished speakers said, well, the demand of people on security matters is increasing, but the capabilities of individual states is diminishing. I totally agree with that view, and the security concerns after especially the end of Cold War, it has changed considerably. Security in the past, we all know very well that was provided, especially against the external threats, by the military. But today, when we talk about security of one country, we are not limited by the capabilities of this country, of that specific country, but also the effects from around are to be taken into consideration. Along with the military threat, there are several others. So I believe that in that forum, and also in other forums all over the world, when security comes out as an issue, we will find ourselves in an environment that we have to take into consideration several other factors. And economy, I believe, is probably the core of that issue. So before, I mean, not avoiding repeating the same things that now and then has been spoken, told by several speakers, including my colleagues here, I would like to compile the affecting factors first, and then very shortly, briefly, I shall try to describe what kind of threats and risks we face in the region that my country is situated. Now, first of all, what makes me afraid is, frankly, at night I have not a problem similar to Mrs. Çelebioglu, my wife might have, but I say fear probably is the key word that keeps one awake. So what makes us be afraid of? I have some points here. Shortly, I would like to mention them. I'm living in an earthquake zone. It's a natural disaster. You can't prevent it. A volcano eruption somewhere else. Nobody can do anything. But there may be early warnings. And pollution We are suffering very much from water pollution, the pollution of the seas around our country, and also air pollution, carbon emission, which may be controlled by us. And it is not a matter of one country to be concerned about. It's a matter that globally we must be concerned about. Today again, during lunchtime, one of the speakers stressed that there should be international cooperation on several matters. Globalization, we may like or we may not like, is a fact. And several innovations, technological advances, information exchange, etc. These affected several countries, and the threat to one country may be also the threat to another country. And the geographical distances are less important during that time. I'm talking with the sense of security only. And so environmental concerns is a matter that affects our security very much. And the second point that I would like to make is the amount and the quality of fresh water. The population is increasing in the world, and the resources are decreasing in many parts of the world. And border crossing rivers are a matter of concern for several countries, including mine. So we must be concerned about the austerity of freshwater resources. Then again, there is the nuclear issue. First, we need energy. We have nuclear power plants all over the world, not in Turkey. We are in the preparation of having 2 of them. But the Chernobyl accident in Ukraine was a Holocaust and a source of fear for Turkey, because we were afraid that the nuclear fallout would do certain harm to our country also. And with that fear, I remember that they destroyed lots of agricultural products in northeastern Turkey at that time, that they could be infected by radiation. So measures of security for such plants are very important. And around Turkey, there are, in some countries, we believe that there are some power plants which have been built by older technologies and not considered as safe as they should be. And starting by nuclear power plants, then nuclear weapons. Well, around our country, there are several threats that we are concerned about nuclear weapons. Turkey, as a member of NATO, lived for a long time next to the Warsaw Pact countries, Russia namely, Soviet Union namely. And there was a large arsenal over there. During all my professional life, we had plans to protect ourselves in a probable nuclear warfare, built shelters, exercised, and consumed our valuable times with that fear. And today, the proliferation of these weapons to several other countries is a major concern for Turkey. There are countries who admit that they have them. There are countries that are supposed to have them, but they neither admit nor refuse. And there are countries so said they are in the process of acquiring them, but they refuse. And all these happen around my own country. So it is a source of fear. for us. On the other hand, of course, terrorism. Before 9/11, my country, for almost 20 years, was one of the suffering ones among the world community from terrorism. We stressed in every gathering like that it might be a danger to the whole humanity. But we were not successful. After 9/11, it is fortunately recognized as a threat to the whole world. So terrorism, in my belief, is a very dangerous threat for the humanity, for all nations, that we must come together to fight with it. Of course, the mass destruction weapons, or that biological, chemical, or if nuclear weapons are in the hands of these irresponsible groups, one can imagine what kind of a threat we will be faced with. Cyber threats. Today, everything, all our daily life, is dependent upon information media and also computers. A naval ship, a warship, without, let me say, the fire control system paralyzed, or communication system paralyzed, is no different than a bathtub swimming at sea. So even the military power may be affected by cyber threats. And it is not a national, peculiar to one nation as a threat, but it's a threat to everybody, companies, trade, all our daily life, electricity, energy resources. Everything is dependent upon these subjects. Energy resources, we know very well that it is very limited, and it is becoming very much limited also. Fossil resources, oil, gas, etc. Well, they say the resources are limited, and the population and the demand is increasing. There are developing countries which have to improve their industrial capabilities. They need more energy. Energy security is something else. Controlling resources, safe transportation of these energy resources is very, very important. That's why we have in Indian Ocean to secure the transportation lines of the ships against piracy. And I don't want to be very lengthy, so I apologize, Mr. Chairman, but there are of course, the domestic problems, which is common to many nations, like Mrs. Çelebioglu just mentioned some of them. We have problems of democracy versus totalitarian regimes. And as you have just mentioned, sir, after Arab Spring, what will happen? Yes, the totalitarian regimes in Tunisia and Egypt disappeared, but what will be next? This is an important question, and also affects the neighboring nations due to the effect on especially trade and export of stability because of religious affinity, etc. So it is an important point. Well, health became very important because now epidemics very easily are spreading all over the world at times. We live through them. Also, illegal immigration is a result of globalization also. Now there are developed countries, underdeveloped countries, developing countries, etc. But that means that the poor, if they cannot have labor, if they cannot support their lives, they will immigrate to the other places. And illegal immigration is a problem for many countries, including my country, because Turkey, if not herself, is an area of transit to the other countries. So it's a serious problem. And unemployment, of course, for internal disorders is a main source of concern. Anyway, instability due to ethnicity, religion, lack of justice, distribution of wealth, and several other problems can be mentioned. Why I said this is just to remind that when we talk about security at this time, it is not the military only. And military is just one tool. And in general, as an old military with an experience of 42 years of active duty, I have the impression that military operations, military clashes, will be less and less in the future. The reason is, including the United States, there are, I believe, there are several signs of it that they will be reluctant to get involved in military operations here and there that is of interest to their country. But military power is very expensive, became very expensive. And any nation to have a big military power must take into consideration what kind of cuts they will have from other areas. And again, the support of this military is very expensive because the new innovations in weapons makes them very expensive. And also, the personnel is very expensive and quite scarce because they should be very much experienced to use these sophisticated weapons. So military probably will be the last resort of any country in the globe to solve their problems with others.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This is, in general, what I would like to say. But
you.
if there is any question about my own country, I'll be delighted to reply.
Later, Admiral, I will ask you to, of all the litany of problems, name one that is the most worry to you. Later. Let's go to Clyde. Clyde, you're the American on this panel. And Americans always have the last word. We all know that, right? As of today, certainly still the case. So you have the last word. I think that the Admiral has already listed up all the issues. So you just tell us what are the ones that you think, perhaps as an American or as an individual, that worries you.
Well, I have to say, Ronnie, I've been sleeping well recently. I haven't been losing a lot of sleep, but now listening to all these people, I'm not going to sleep tonight.
I'm sorry.
Let me quickly, I have short-term concerns, medium-term, and long-terms. In the short term, there are three things that I think are very dangerous. One is the potential of an Israeli strike on Iran. I think that potential is significant. I think it's extremely dangerous for the United States, for me personally, and for everybody in the room because of the obvious impact it would have on the Gulf region. Second is the question of North Korea. North Korea has nuclear weapons. It has been testing or says it's been testing. No one seems to know what's happening in North Korea. But the potential for some kind of a nuclear attack or nuclear incident, I think is, again, significant and very dangerous. The Chinese and Japanese conflict over the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands in the Western Pacific strikes me as potentially one of those kinds of problems that don't appear to be terribly dangerous until they become terribly dangerous. These incidents can take on a life of their own, and because of the, as I mentioned at lunch, the security treaty between the U.S. and Japan, the U.S. inevitably gets pulled into this kind of situation. So I think this is a very dangerous situation that needs to be resolved as quickly as possible. And then let me just broaden that and say that I don't think that China poses a threat to the United States. I don't believe that the United States poses a threat to China. And yet, I'm concerned that both China and the US are increasingly becoming involved in a dynamic that seems to pull them into confrontation. And that obviously could become quite dangerous. In the medium term, I'm concerned about economic crisis. I think that the potential for a repetition of the financial crisis of 2008, 2009 is quite high. Recent congressional hearings in the US and recent articles in The Atlantic magazine have demonstrated that many of the world's largest banks and their key executives really have little idea of the risk at which their banks stand. They're engaged in the same kind of unregulated derivative trading that led to the collapse in 2008, except that the numbers are bigger and the risks have become higher. So I think the potential for a repetition is significant. That worries me. And I share the concern of cyber threats. I just, over the past weekend, I had a personal incident where the server on my company went down. I had no email for 2 days. Now, you know, for most of my life, I had no email. There was no such thing as email. But I found out that 2 days of new email, and I didn't have any sleep. It was really bad. Now, you know, imagine that a major medical center, or in the US, the American electrical grid is old, it hasn't been updated, it's vulnerable. There are so many vulnerabilities, and the hackers are so good, and they don't have to be governmental hackers. So I think that poses very dangerous threats. And then finally, let me mention something that's very long-term, but very significant, that's demographics. With the exception of India, every other major population center, Europe, North America, Asia, Japan, China, are facing population decline. All of them have aging populations, falling birth rates. They're not replacing their populations. And so we're looking at a world in 20 or 25 years in which people are going to be old and sick. And the number of people available to take care of them and to pay for them is going to be smaller and smaller. This, I don't think, is a sustainable situation. And yet, it seems to be a corollary, or let's say that the correlation between economic development, rising income, and falling population is very strong. And so all of those of us who are trying to promote globalization and economic development I sometimes wonder if we're engaged in an act of suicide. Now, this is very long-term suicide, but still, it's not an insignificant issue, except in India. And maybe what this means is that eventually India will just take over the world, and it'll be an Indian world.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Admiral, would you like to pick one of the many, many issues that you mentioned that really keeps you awake?
Well,
Just
thank you very much. Maybe I should add, how do we see around Turkey? Go to the specifics of threat in our country.
Make it short, please.
Very shortly, very shortly. We are very much concerned about Syrian situation, of course. Although Turks do not want to get involved militarily into that situation. We are suffering from almost 200,000 immigrants from Syria. That's an economic burden on my country. Plus, there are security concerns also. And Iraq, after U.S. withdrawal, is in a very unstable situation. There are clashes between several factions, religious differences, ethnic differences, etc., which affects Turkey also. And we are concerned about the Israeli-Iran conflict very much, too, because we are neighbors to both countries. And Iran, we don't know whether they intend to have nuclear weapons or not. But if so, will be an area of trouble for us. With Greece, we had several problems for years, but it's forgotten now. We are in good terms, but the problems are frozen over there. We are concerned about Arab Spring and the spread of it to other countries in the region. And it's not, as I said, only the matter of totalitarian regimes disappearing, but what will be the next kind of system governance in these countries is a matter of concern for Turkey. Fortunately, we have a very peaceful, I would say, situation in Black Sea, which was a main area of concern and threat towards Turkey during Cold War. But today we have relatively very good relationships with the countries around the Black Sea, which is quite comforting for us. Thank you very much.
Very good, very good. Okay, now let me invite the audience to do either one of two things. Number one, add your concern that is not already mentioned here. So if it is already mentioned here, please don't mention it again. I think the panelists did a fantastic job already, number one. Number two, if you have any questions that you want to challenge the panelists, please feel free to do so. Anybody? Yes, sir. The gentleman in front, and then the gentleman over there. Yeah, the microphone is right behind you, to your left.
My name is Jacob Adibia, Nigeria High Commission. I have a question for the Admiral. We know that suicide is taking one's life. When it comes to suicide bombing, it means how many people will go with me. Admiral, have you ever thought of what drives a man to take this extreme measure, to kill himself and as many as he can go along with? Thank you.
Any philosophical answer to that, Admiral?
Sorry?
Any philosophical answer to that question?
I just couldn't get the question exactly.
What would drive somebody to become a suicide bomber?
Yes, all right. Really, I think that the main reason, I believe, that's my personal view, I don't know, I'm not involved in these things very much, but I read in the newspapers, and some of such incidents are happening in my country also. One important reason, I believe, is belief, religion. And the other reason is washed brains for, ethnic reasons, for kind of expectations of freedom, new countries to be established, and things like that. But the organizations sometimes brainwash, especially young men whose expectations are wide range, and they are trained like that. And some of them also, that happened in Turkey too. Some of them are really sick, either physically or mentally. So they are very much useful for such purposes to be exploited by these kind of, especially terrorist organizations. These are probably the subjects that I could mention. As I said, it's not my area of expertise at all.
Can I add, Clyde, when you mentioned about demographics, that India is the only country without, that would not have that problem, huh? That history shows that war is always started by 20 to 30-year-old who have too much testosterone.
Yes.
And suicidal bombers also tend to be in that age range. And hence, that is not an issue. Yes, the gentleman over here, please.
Yes, my name is Cengiz Can. I'm from Turkey, and I'm an analphabet on economic and financial issues, so I'm a happy person. I don't have worries as such. The question I would like to ask is to the Foreign Secretary, Mr. Sibal, that you have mentioned, sir, in terms of the threats they made, that might wake you up at night. One of them, you mentioned the civil war in Afghanistan as a scenario. So could you elaborate how it might have an impact on the situation in India and what sort of a security problem that might emanate from a civil war that might take place in Afghanistan?
Now the thing is that the ethnic divisions in Afghanistan have become very sharp between the Pashtuns and non-Pashtuns. And it just so happens that the Taliban are Pashtuns, and they are pitted against the other ethnic groups in Afghanistan. Now those ethnic groups have been in power in Afghanistan, although Karzai is a Pashtun, but effectively the people who are holding power in their respective areas in northern and western Afghanistan are the people of the Northern Alliance. Even the Hazaras are feeling very powerful and empowered. They are not going to accept the Taliban coming to power in Afghanistan or even sharing power. Because if, according to the plans that have been discussed recently in London, if the idea is to give governorships and ministerial cabinet berths to the Taliban and this and that in order to incorporate them into the peace process, etc., then you are creating the opening for them to eventually take over power. And this will be resisted. And then you have the element of Pakistan, which sees the Taliban as their natural ally, because the only people in Afghanistan who they could instrumentalize to protect their interests, either vis-a-vis India or anybody else, are the Taliban, which would then, theoretically, push countries like India to revive their support for the Northern Alliance, as happened in the past, along with Iran and Russia. This is absolutely not the route that we would like to go towards, but this can potentially happen. And why? Firstly, because the ideology of the Taliban is totally antithetical to the kind of India we want to consolidate. You know, secular state, harmony between the religions, elimination of radical ideologies, etc., etc. But if we have right along our borders with the radicalization of Pakistan and the Talibanization of Afghanistan, whole or in part, we have a huge pool of these radical extremist ideologies which will put enormous pressure on our polity. So we don't want that. Number two, there have been in the past, as you know, training camps in those parts of Afghanistan ruled by the Taliban, which were used by the Pakistani ISI to send terrorists into Jammu and Kashmir, and these can be revived. That is the second aspect that worries. And third, of course, that we can never have a Central Asian policy of any credibility if there is Pakistan and then there is Talibanized Afghanistan. And this is bad for the stability of Central Asia. And all of us, including Turkey, have an interest in the stability of Central Asia and moderate Islam there.
Okay, any other? Yes. Ingo, in front. From Latin America, Brazil.
Ingo Blöger from Brazil. I would make the question, if you wouldn't sleep at night, if you know that the mobilization of the people could make instantaneously by networking, how you feel that with experience that we had felt also in North Africa or in other countries where we have immediately mobilization from people, they are beyond of parties, they are beyond of regular organization, who use the networking and mobile themselves for an issue that they suppose to be very important. What's the kind of democracy we will have in the next years when such kind of mobilization will be in a very intensive form?
So non-state actors using internet and using telecommunication to do terror.
No, only to be mobilized.
Just mobilize. Mobilize for what?
Instabilities.
Stability. You mean within a country? Yes. Okay. I assume that the question is within a democratic country, since you said that what effect it will have on democracy, right? You worry about that?
You want me to answer?
Yeah. Secretary Salim?
Well, I think we have to look at this phenomenon in a somewhat nuanced manner. It has caught the attention of everyone because what happened in Tahrir Square especially. And young urbanites who want to express their dissatisfaction and not satisfied with governance, or they don't get what they want from the government on issues of specific interest to them, are networked on these social media and take to the streets and make a lot of noise. Now what happens is that the media, at least I'm speaking about India, but this would be true of most countries, is very much today a product of middle class preferences and interests. Urbanized middle class preference and interest. So something that then churns up in the middle class gets total focus from the media. Total focus on the media. So in fact, all these demonstrations and everything else get tremendous boost through the media, and the impression is created that the entire nation is in some sort of a turmoil, which is not true, especially of countries, the developing countries, which are relatively little urbanized, partially urbanized. Most of the countries live in rural areas. Internet penetration is not very much. People are not using Twitter or Facebook except the young urbanites. So in the hinterland of the country where the large population lives, there is virtually no impact. There's virtually no impact. And the result of this you see in Egypt. All the noise was created by these fellows. And who are the guys who come to power? The Islamists, the Salafists, the Muslim Brotherhood, and this and that. The rural voters. So the reality of the country is quite different, will remain quite different, until, of course, you reach the developed country status. But if you reach the developed country status, then you may not have phenomenon like that.
One last. If not, I'm going to ask China a question, if I may. You are not only the only business woman on this panel, you're also the only woman on this panel. You hear all these men talking about, the other men talking about all those terrible things that can happen. And by the way, history shows that most of them are instigated by men. I'm sorry. So, representing 50% of the world's population, China, tell us, Is there a solution to any of these things? How can we make the world a better place, a safer place? Just any simple ideas. Sometimes the most profound are the most simple. And sometimes it takes people who are less of a problem, such as women, to come up with solutions that can perhaps help the rest of us. So before I sum up, Jana, would you care to make some comments?
I try. It's a very difficult question, but I just can tell you, I think, how I cope with these issues, how I cope or I recommend to my friends, because actually, as you rightly said, there is, if there was a solution to be, I think, told with anyone, at the moment, the world will be much different. What I can tell you, actually, why I come to India, for example, this is my solution. Because I'm coming from Turkey. It's an Islamic country, but it is secular for so many years. So religion is not too powerful in our life, until right now, at least. But in India, actually, there are many different religions, many different, I think, culture. But still, we have, I think, about 70 million. India has 1.2 or 3. Still, when I arrive here, I find a positive energy. I cannot find this in anywhere until right now. I think that's why this question can be answered by the Indian, how they can find their peace in this, different culture, different religion. I really feel very much relaxed in this country. When I go back, I feel stressful in the next day.
Uh-oh. Well, very good.
I have a one-liner answer to what
Yes,
you said.
fine. Yes.
That instead of nightmares, let's start dreaming.
Let's start dreaming.
Then you will have this solutions.
Dreaming of good dreams. Very good. Anyway, let me just conclude by just 2 minutes. A couple of years ago, one morning I got up and I decided to write down all my horrors. Basically what I asked these ladies and gentlemen on the stage, and I wrote down myself. I have 7 of them. And it's basically mentioned by the admiral, but I will repeat them with one reason. Number 1, earthquake, tsunamis, and so forth. After Japan, you understand. Number 2, climate change, water, food. Number 3, pandemics, pestilence. Coming from Hong Kong, you know SARS? You know what is SARS? You remember that, right? Nobody has as much first-hand experience of that as I did. The center of it, by the way, was in a property that I developed in Hong Kong. So you have bird flu, swine flu, virus, AIDS, so forth, pandemics. Number 4, terrorism. Number 5, cyber war. Number 6, hot war. Perhaps, I hope, Admiral, you are right. And finally, the last one was only mentioned by Clyde, and I just want to spend the remaining 1 minute on it, and that is financial collapse. Very few people have mentioned it, but let me tell you, coming from Asia, East Asia, in 1998, there were $2 trillion sloshing around the world every day, approximately 95% of which is not accountable for by trades of goods and services or reasonable hedging. So 95% of it is speculation. 2008, 10 years later, all that the West told us East Asians not to do, they committed themselves. And then they had their own problem. By that time, the world probably has had, estimation only, of course, 5 to 10 times more money sloshing around the world every day. So perhaps $10 trillion. Made possible by technology, of course. $10 trillion perhaps? How much has international trade grown in those intervening 10 to 15 years? Not much. So when you have $10 trillion sloshing around the world, the whole thing is built on one word: confidence or trust. And once that breaks, you stare at the precipice, as Hank Paulson and Tim Geithner did once, They managed to pull us back. The rest of the world managed to pull us back. But I just wonder if that situation cannot happen again. And Clyde, I agree with you that the possibility of that happening again is very good. How does the 10 trillion US dollars come about every day? You have fiat money. That's not that much. You can count them. But on top of fiat money, you have leverage. And in Asia, and during the Asia financial crisis, George Soros told the Hong Kong government official that you can never defeat us because for every dollar for you to defend the Hong Kong dollars, you need $1. But for me to attack, for every dollar, I only need 3.5 cents. Capital ratio was 3.3, 3% actually. By 2008, it was 60 to 1. Morgan Stanley, they admitted that they were leveraged up 60 to 1. And then on top of that, Clyde, what you mentioned, on top of the leverage, you have derivatives. And then you have secondary derivative upon first degree derivatives. And then third degree, perhaps, upon second degree, upon first degree, upon the borrowed money, upon the fiat money. We used to joke that perhaps some investment banker somewhere, maybe an Indian genius, math experts that come up with all these products that hardly anyone would understand. And with 10 trillion of US dollars of that sloshing around the world, confidence is absolutely critical. You lose that, the whole world can go to hell. And I better stop there. I have another story to tell, but I better not. It's 4:30 right now. I'm 5 seconds late. It is not a beautiful thought, but I suppose the only thing we can trust in is perhaps there's still some good in man. Apart from that, I'm not sure if the system will be able to manage. Somebody say, hey, what you need for the financial service is better regulation. I said, no, regulation doesn't work. It's necessary, but it won't work. Reason. If you have no product, there's nothing to regulate. Especially with American legal system, which emphasizes the letter of the law more than the spirit of the law, unlike the British, which in my opinion is a better system. So anything that is not obviously, statedly prohibited is doable. And so when that is the case, regulation would not work because if there's nothing to regulate, by the time you need to regulate, it's already too late. It's already caused too much havoc. And not to mention that all the smartest brain, because of the compensation system these days in the world, the best brain go to investment banking in the West. And so dummies like me go join the regulatory bodies. And so it is me playing basketball with Yao Ming. You know who's Yao Ming? What is the chance of Ronnie Chan beating Yao Ming in basketball? And so the system is a very fragile one, as a former chairman of one of the biggest, most successful investment bank told me one time, a good friend of mine, that plan for it, at least individually plan for it, if not systematically. So I think that, sorry to help you lose your sleep tonight, but I think that from time to time it's useful to think about these things, and each of us could ask at least one question: how can I do my little part to perhaps make the world a safer place? Thank you very much for your attention. A big round of applause for my panelists.